Hey everybody, it's Ian. Now we're going to start summing up calendar customs. Just reflecting on what we talked about already in terms of the rites of passage. If you remember, rites of passage are about the individual, but they are really the individual going through different stages within a group, as is witnessed by the group. And one of the things that the group is doing for the individual is basically guiding them through that, reminding them that this is a transitional time, but that the group has their back, that the group is ready and willing, and in fact, it's necessary to guide people from one stage where they have grown, to which they've grown accustomed, to which they have grown perhaps comfortable, but at the same time, perhaps they've grown tired, and moving them to another that gives them new freedoms and responsibilities and takes some freedoms and from responsibilities away from them. It is a new stage. It is a step into something akin to the unknown, and the group is there to let them know that, well, we've done this before, and we know what we're doing, and we'll get you through this. While at the same time, the group meets and reminds itself that it is only comprised of individuals who are moving through these stages, who go through the various levels, not necessarily hierarchically tiered, but through age up to a point of some kind of something akin to seniority or elder, or from initiate to elder status, and then eventually they disappear and new ones enter, and that the group will still remain. The group has a constancy. The group has a sense of permanence, despite the fact that things change. I've come to discover the calendar customs are basically doing the same thing. Obviously, not in the same way for the individual, but they reflect on the individual. They reflect on the fact that we do live in linear time and that people move through, and we live in a linear history, and things change and events happen that cannot necessarily be undone. Most importantly, people who enter into the world, and we don't wish that undone, and people who depart, and perhaps we do. But we have to deal with that reality. And we have to deal with the fact that change happens. Yet, we go through this time cyclically. And there are things that are recurrent. And the things that are recurrent are, well, we could start with the idea of the seasons. And then, prescinding from that, we can see a whole host of things that repeat upon themselves. Whether that is the repetition of nature, or whether it is the repetition of the societal structures that have grown around in part along the natural calendar, but have a history in and of themselves. So whether we're talking about harvest, whether we're talking about solstice, or whether we're talking about graduation, or whether we're talking about civic holidays that just happen to be associated with a calendrical event, we can gather together again the way we have gathered together before. We gather together informed by the story that that thing celebrates, that thing commemorates, because almost all calendar customs have some undergirding narrative that we do this because on this day or at this particular time something happened, whether that is the natural cycle, or whether that is a sacred narrative, or whether that is a civic narrative. Something happened, and on this day we remember that, and we do it again. So we have a cloud of symbols, a host of symbols around those particular days, and we congregate and we take time away from our regular everyday occurrences, our quotidian life, and we re-establish ourselves, we refresh ourselves, we remember ourselves as a group participating in this particular narrative. The next one, we will gather again and remind ourselves as a group participating in that particular narrative, or that particular episode in that shared narrative. We should always remember that as much as we ascribe these to the participation in sacred narratives and so on, they are fun, they are joyful, they are a break from the day-to-day, they are a break from the quotidian, and we really don't need to find a justification for why we want a break from the routine to do something special, to do something that is special in part because it is only once a year. We don't need to justify joy, we don't need to justify fun and frivolity. All we were doing when we were tracing back in these histories is, well, where did this particular way that we have decided to manifest fun and shape our fun on this day come from. So you never need an excuse to stop and get together and rejoice and have fun and imbibe and dance and sing and wear stupid clothes. Clothes you wouldn't wear at other times of year, but this time of year you do it. And by doing so, you are reaffirming your place, your group's place, as and your group's existence as ongoing and permanent. That doesn't mean that you do it in the same way each and every year, but like all traditions, you do it in a way that is informed by what has gone previously. And next time you do it, this iteration will inform the next time, and so on. There is, of course, going to be change and flux. New ones are going to enter into it, but there is this same, even as things are in flux, there's this sense of continuity with the past. And we do it every year. We do it on a cycle because we choose to, because we take the solar year as an important way of measuring steps in that linear progress. It's like, we are progressing, and at the same time we are circling back, and we remain constant. So we did 9 readings, eight readings, and then Santino's reading that sort of introduced our study, his reading on sort of the holiday in general and his understanding of the calendar year, which again informs a lot. We did Aguilar's study on the Day of the Dead, and her approach being particularly, remember, it was within a special issue that also dealt with folk costume, but the notion of how this small town became introduced new elements, particularly the beauty pageant, introduced new elements to the traditional Day of the Dead ceremony. The 3 days of the Day of the Dead, how this beauty pageant, which seems to actually have an explicitly American context, an American origin, nevertheless was able to be incorporated into this small town's celebrations and seen as important as the decorating of the house, the setting up of the altars, the dancing in the streets in order to ward off the angel of death, and so on. So it's a good, even within a fairly conservative region of Mexico, it's a good example of how new elements can become incorporated into these celebrations, even when these celebrations, one of the rationales for doing so is to denote identity in contrast to. Remember, Day of the Dead, one of the things that's important about it is that it is different from Spanish, and it is different from America, 2 of the large imperial presences in Mexico. No, this is not a Spanish thing. This is a Mexican thing. It has as much indigenous origins as it has Spanish. In fact, it has more indigenous origins. It's basically a Catholicized indigenous celebration. And conversely, it is not Halloween. It takes place at the same time, but it is not Halloween. It might have its similar origins in terms of All Hallows Eve and All Saints Days and All Souls Day celebration, but it is not Halloween. And keeping that American influence and that out of the celebration is important, despite the fact that other American influences like the beauty pageant are incorporated into it. The next reading was Chiaramontes on mumming in Deep Harbor. So that's the 12 days of Christmas, the celebrations in the not fictional town, but the pseudonymous town of Deep Harbor, and how that incredibly deep reading that he does on mumming, in that the house visits are a breach of the typical ways that homes and households in Newfoundland understand themselves as basically independent units, and that men hardly ever go into other men's houses. If they socialize, it's usually in the neutral spaces. Drinking is minimal. Drinking is, and the sharing and the reciprocity of drinking is very important, because you're in a sort of zero sum situation, and so you can never be seen to be owing or to be owed. Then that, and to maintain that kind of balance is an important aspect of outport life. It's a way of keeping social cohesion going. And then with this inversion of the norm, the 12 days, the mumming, the house visits, the going house to house, the drinking, the carousing, nevertheless, people are paying attention to this issue of reciprocity. And so if you don't ask for a drink, you are offered a drink, and you take the one drink, and basically there's a mathematics that's going on in the head. So the mumming becomes expressly that, just as we've been talking about. It's a reaffirmation of the group as being in a series of complicated social relations. It's, in a way, it's kind of a distillation of that group premise. It isn't simply the people of Deep Harbor, although of course that is the end point, but it's how the people of Deep Harbor are. Every one of them is basically in a social relationship with everyone else, and you are in this process of reaffirming that status, including reaffirming the status of conflict and reaffirming the status of this person is dead to me. And so, but this becomes the playful, masked, performative way of doing that, and yet there's still serious business that's happening underneath. And then we had Gallipo's study at the same time of year on Tibetan Christmas, where you have Christmas as through the 19th century. You had the beginning of French missionaries coming to Tibet. It's with some success, with some failure, and then eventually establishing a Catholic community that, even when it became expelled permanently in 1950, when the missionaries were expelled permanently in 1950, having already been expelled earlier in the century, but with the annexation of Tibet by the Chinese government and the communist government, the Catholic community survived and maintained a Christmas tradition that was remarkably syncretic. And then Tibet, in China in whole, and Tibet specifically, actually started promoting the multiculturalism of the area. And so this town's Christmas celebrations became part of the tourist enterprise. So Gallipo notes how you have the Catholic community present at Christmas. You have and the celebration is, again, syncretic. It involves sort of staunch French Catholic masses, although sustained for 50 or 60 years by the people themselves, not by the intermediary of an ordained priest. You have Tibetan song brought into it. You have Tibetan dress, but you also have Santa Claus hats. You have evergreen trees. I mean, the Chinese flora of evergreen, so not like a balsam fir, but nevertheless a recognizable evergreen that is actually in the church most of the year, and then is decorated in Christians in North American Christmas tree style over Christmas. And so you have the Catholic community participating. You have the non-Catholic local community participating, because they don't have much in the way of community rites and community celebrations, and the entire thing is done joyously, and it's a celebration. It's not a dour ceremony. It doesn't take place in the homes. It's a communal ceremony. People aren't decorating in the house. So it is basically a community celebration. And then you have this thick gamut of tourists and anthropologists, basically, who are coming to witness this remarkable syncretic event. And so it is sort of recognizably, to an outsider, to a North American like myself, it's recognizably a Christmas celebration, while simultaneously it is recognizably other. It's recognizably, from what I understand, Tibetan. And so so it's a great example of how of how the cluster of symbols that comprise any holiday, any calendar custom, can easily be adapted to other situations and absorbed in a way that is again syncretic, without diluting the meaning. It just becomes this new thing. It enters into a new ecosystem, and it finds purchase there in a way that is recognizably the same and recognizably different simultaneously. And then we had Hugoson's article on the Easter tree in Sweden. So again, this like something that was has some sense of continuity in with the past in terms of using birch trees and birch twigs within the household at Easter time. Then you had it basically as the beginnings of it as a tourist phenomena, or at least the tourist phenomena that is trying to enter into the Guinness Book of World Records for largest Easter twigs. And when largest Easter twigs were recognized by Guinness as not really being a thing that they could measure, nevertheless, the tree made sense. It was similar to but different from the maypole. It was similar to but different from the Christmas tree, and it was a way of entering into a public civic celebration of Easter that was simultaneously fairly secular. And so the immigrant community was willing participants in it, in large part because in the same way that a Christmas tree is obviously associated with Christmas, but isn't necessarily associated with the Christian Christmas story, so too with the Easter tree, obviously integrally related to Easter, but not part of the Passion narrative. So even though by the time she had written it, it was less than a decade old, it is something that had found meaning because it was immediately recognized by both civic leaders and, more importantly, by the folk themselves as apt, as suitable, as something that seems to make sense and fits into that forest of symbols. And then you had Schmidt's article on May the 4th, and he was focusing mainly on memes and the way it is sort of celebrated in the digital sphere, but how a narrative, a popular culture narrative, something that is less than, just doing the math, less than 45 years old, less than 50 years old, and what is more, a pun that arises from that particular narrative, May the 4th, takes on some kind of resonant meaning, and you have this participation that is always going to be understood as playful, but not necessarily ironic in the way that one might suggest. That even though it is, we recognize that this is a movie, it is something that nevertheless binds people together. On that day, everyone is a Star Wars fan in the same way that on St. Patrick's Day, everyone is Irish, and on Valentine's Day, everyone is in love, and so on. So it becomes this, perhaps only would the internet be able to do this, but it generates a meaningful day that has not simple. It goes beyond the ironic play on words to something that then has marketing appeal. We can't forget that in terms of how radio stations and television stations might have May the 4th promotions, and how StarWars.com and now Disney Plus itself has a whole host of Star Wars Day things on their schedule, and indications on their websites about how to celebrate Star Wars Day. But it also becomes a time for gathering. It becomes a time for dress. It becomes a time for particular forms of clothing. So it really functions as a rite of passage, as a calendar custom, even without it having the imprimatur of, the state sanctioning it. And then you have Sheila Bach's article on grad caps and graduation, and particularly, again, sort of a modern, even though it has some precedent in like the 60s and 1970s in the graduating and the decoration of caps. It's really like a post-Instagram phenomenon where first grad caps is being decorated. So something that takes the blank uniform, the intense uniformity, just to be redundant, of the graduation dress, and particularly the hat, because the hat is a significant marker of the act of graduating. And then, so taking that, the anonymous aspect of it, and turning it into something that, first of all, attracts attention. So the grad cap in general attracts attention, makes this blank canvas unique, and draws the eye forward. And then, Latinx grad caps, it becomes something that is then communicates a message of purpose, of meaning, a message of success in a world that is more or less indifferent to your success. So, and demonstrating both the I have succeeded within the quote unquote American dream in terms of university success, and yet I have not given up or disavowed my Latinx heritage. And so they become these, again, these sort of potent symbols. And then through hashtags, you sort of transcend the graduating class of a particular institution, and you basically create a cohort of Latinx women who are graduating despite the climate of adversity that is into which they're graduating. Then you had Blank's article on Juneteenth in San Francisco, and so again you have a ceremony that was a celebratory day that started in one place and started in Texas and has specific, incredibly important historical moment that was commemorated by the people who were immediately affected by it, and then as several generations later, well, 2 generations later, several decades later, descendants of that group move over to San Francisco, and first as a promotional campaign for bars, basically reinvigorate this idea of an African American celebration, but as a form of adult urban sophistication and entertainment and nightclubs, as opposed to the familial days that were happening in Texas. And then since 1945, you have this celebration that's gone through further transformations as it moves away from simply being this African American urban entertainment ludic celebration to something that is about defining neighborhood and defining place. It is a particular time when people were being economically driven from that time, from that place, from that neighborhood, where the Western addition was being slowly renovated by the city, and the African American community was being pushed out, and in the name of new development. And so they became these cultural festivals that are about, and still in a very safe and respectable way, parade, marching bands and so on, food stalls. They became a way of reclaiming and reaffirming space within the larger situation. So again, Juneteenth can never be anything but at its core an African American celebration. But that, first of all, that doesn't exclude others from participating in it. It just precludes others participating in it to the exclusion of African Americans. And it also means, well, what does it mean to be African American at any given time, in any given place? And then how is Juneteenth incorporated into that understanding? And then you have Billington's article, some nice, cool, old school folklore where we're going back and we're just challenging the assumptions of how midsummer was celebrated by pagans, and they sort of had this weird sort of sun worship idea and fighting away the sun, not going gentle into that good night, and a whole bunch of different assertions that were had. But if you read the historical record, as Billington does, it's recognition that no, they didn't really celebrate midsummer, that this understanding of midsummer is a much more modern invention. In fact, it's something that has been retroactively placed upon these celebrations and these origins. Now, they have been celebrating midsummer for a few hundred years, and that doesn't make it any less meaningful. But prior to Christianization, for the most part, there were celebrations at the beginning of summer, and occasionally there were things that happened around the middle of summer. But for the most part, summer was too busy doing actual stuff to drop everything and celebrate. And then when Christianization happened and things got consolidated around the 21st, you're like, okay, well, the general summer things that we do, we can do on this time. So it really becomes this idea of how even these I don't know if you want to call people in 1000 AD ancient or not, but this older generations, many moons ago, they had a bunch of symbols, and someone suggested shifting it over, and it's like, this is as apt, this is as appropriate as anything else, so sure, why not? And so even, we sometimes think about the adaptation and malleability of customs as something that is a modern phenomenon, when clearly it's been going on at all times, because people are creative, people are happy, people are joyous, and people do this sort of thing, and always have, and always will. So that's basically calendar customs. Again, in various aspects of it, talking about sort of the the gathering together, the flexibility of the customs, and the relationship of the day and the informing narrative to the group. And so for your assignment, it's a very similar structure to the first assignment. So in a medium length essay, I say 6 to 8 pages in the syllabus, and it's something along those lines, and using library research, by which I mean online databases as well, or whatever, and reflecting on your own experience. If you have them, answer one of the following questions. So 1, begin with a calendar custom from whichever calendar you follow. Christian, Islamic, Chinese, but also very secular, civic holidays, whatever, First Nations, and whatever calendar you follow, and in which you regularly participate. Using library and other academic sources, outline its history and some of the symbols associated with it. You should also provide a description of your own celebration of it and how that might have changed over the years. That's a fairly standard thing. This is something that I do, my group does, my family does. This is how it's being practiced elsewhere, and now this is how we practice it here. 2. One of the ways of marking customs is through the display of material culture. Do an inventory of one such display, yard art, store windows, in-store displays, and basing your arguments in library and other academic sources, try to identify both traditional and contemporary images and symbols within it. Sort of an inventory, material culture project. It could be fun. There's lawns aplenty, and there's always things like the commercial aspects and store windows that are particularly keyed in. Why do we do it? How does it happen? 3, how has technology changed the way we, or as I mean you, celebrate or perform customs? Using personal examples and basing your arguments in library or other academic sources, discuss the impact of technology on either a calendar custom or a rite of passage, because why not? So fill your boots. And that is somewhat related to question 4, which is obviously new this year. COVID-19. How did the restrictions of the past 18 months affect the celebration of a particular calendar custom? What creative ways were employed to allow it to be marked? And I don't have it in the syllabus, but using library sources and blah, 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 and using your own reflections. But how did something change? We've had an entire year, obviously. And how has this break in how we typically gather together, how has that affected your celebrations of it? Type it up. As in the last assignment, I don't really care what style you use as long as you're consistent, and hand it in, and that'll be great. So that's it. Basically, that is the calendar custom. I have summed it up, and I think I have summed it up swimmingly. Otherwise, I will talk to you later. Be well, and take care. Bye-bye.